Social psychology is very much concerned with understanding how people come to know others. To make sense of others is to know why they take the actions they do. The most important approach to this question is known as attribution theory. Dr. Daniel Gilbert, Associate Professor of Psychology at the University of Texas at Austin, will discuss attribution theory.
Well, there are many different attribution theories, and you'll be very happy to know that I'm not going to give you the specifics of any of them. Because although they are different in many important ways, they share something in common, and it is the heart and soul of attribution theory, and it's really the take-home point that I'd like to give you today. Attribution theories begin with this assumption. What we might call the attributional equation is occasionally called the Lewinian equation, after Kurt Lewin, the father of social psychology, the first person to really point out the relevance of this equation for social psychologists. The Lewinian equation says behavior is a function of situations and dispositions. What we do is some combined function of who we are, what we bring to a situation, and the situational forces or pressures or constraints, and I'll use all three of those words interchangeably, on our behavior. As a result, since behavior is this joint function of situations and dispositions, if we want to know what a person is like, and I trust all of us are algebraically sophisticated enough to know that that is not voodoo, that's just rearranging the equation. If we want to know what a person is like, we want to understand their dispositions, their character traits, we simply look at their behavior and try to subtract out, if you will, the effect of the situation. This principle is embodied in probably the most basic decision rule of attribution theory, called the discounting principle. Before I spell that out for you and tell you in a lot of fancy vernacular what that means, I want to prove to you that the discounting principle is something you already know, that you already know well, and that you use all the time. Here's the dilemma, the problem of the invisible motor. Three situations. In situation A, you see the toy car zooming across the floor, and there's this fan in the background blowing, and you can see those lines. That's the international cartoonist symbol for zoom. B, you have a toy car. It's also zooming across the floor, but it's going in the direction that the fan is blowing. That is, it's going towards the fan. And then finally, in situation C, we see the toy car moving across the floor, and the fan is unplugged. In which of these situations are you confident that the toy car actually has a motor? And in which of these situations do you think maybe it doesn't? The answer, as any 7-year-old will tell you, is that you shouldn't buy toy car A. Both B and C are decent bets. Clearly, car A might just be moving with the wind. I mean, it might have a motor, but it might not. It could be that the fan is blowing it. And so you're not confident that it has anything internal to itself, that there's any inner force moving it. It might be the outer forces that are responsible for its motion or its behavior. In these cases, of course, the car is moving into the wind, or there's no wind at all. We're confident that the car must have a motor, otherwise it wouldn't be traveling like this. Any kid can solve this riddle. That is, any kid understands, at some level, the discounting principle. The discounting principle says two things. An observer should not conclude that a person has a unique predisposition to behave when the person does exactly what the situation pushes him or her to do. And you saw that in the instance of the car. We don't conclude that it has a predisposition to move, that is an engine, if it's going in the same direction as the wind, that is the situational force acting upon it. On the other hand, an observer should conclude that a person has a unique predisposition to behave when A, the person does the opposite of what the situation pushes him or her to do, or B, when there's no situational push of any kind at all. So this discounting principle tells us, it's essentially a recapitulation of the Lewinian equation. It tells us, look at people's behavior, figure out if there was a strong situational force that could account for the behavior. If so, subtract out the effect of that force, and whatever's left, that tells you about the person's dispositions. If you see a person who looks really anxious and nervous, they're behaving anxiously, look around and ask yourself, Is there a situation that could be making them feel anxious? For example, they're about to take a big exam. If so, ask yourself, how much anxiety should taking a big exam provoke? Subtract that out from the behavior you saw, and voila, we have an estimate of the person's disposition. How anxious a person are they in day-to-day life? Do people use the discounting principle? Well, come on, you just used it in the case of the car. So we know that people use it to some degree and in some situations. At least college students who are at a lecture do when they're talking about cars. But what about folks in day-to-day life? In 1967, Jones and Harris did an experiment that was an attempt to test people's use of the discounting principle. Do people take situations into account when making judgments about others' dispositions? The test was really, had it worked out the way the experimenters thought it would, really somewhat mundane. The results shouldn't have been very exciting. Here's what they did. They brought a lot of subjects to their laboratory, and they gave these subjects some essays to read. Some subjects read essays that were in support of Fidel Castro. Now, you must remember in 1967, this is a burning issue. Was Castro a good guy or a bad guy? And most Americans thought he was a bad guy. So some subjects read essays that were in support of Fidel Castro, and others read essays that were opposed to Fidel Castro. And the subjects were given the task of deciding what the essay writer's true personal attitude towards Castro was. That is, what kind of dispositional inclination did they have towards Castro? Now you're thinking, boy, that's a really hard experiment, isn't it? The guy says, I hate his guts. What could he believe? I think he believes that he doesn't like him. Indeed, there was a control condition in which subjects simply read these essays and tried to figure out what the essay writer's real personal attitude was. But there was another interesting experimental condition. In the experimental condition, subjects were told, in addition to what I've already told you, that these essays were not written under conditions of free choice. In fact, they were written by debaters who had been assigned to defend these topics by their debate coach. Now, all of you know, of course, that debaters write on they're like lawyers. They don't believe what they say necessarily. They just try to argue it well. That's their job. You can imagine that in this situation, it's rather difficult to figure out what the essay writer's true opinion is. You're reading this pro-Castro essay, but on the other hand, you know that the person who wrote it was simply assigned to do so by this powerful authority figure in his or her life. The people who had been assigned to write essays by a debate coach were, in a sense, like cars moving with the wind. They might have motors, they might not. No good reason to suspect they're particularly pro or anti-Castro. Here's what Jones and Harris found. Is this visible in the back? Okay. These leftmost bars are most decidedly unspectacular. What we see measured on the ordinate is how pro-Castro the subjects thought the essay writers were. What we see here is that when, believe it or not, a person freely wrote a pro-Castro essay, they were seen as much more pro-Castro than somebody who freely wrote an anti-Castro essay. Who would have thunk it? But look at something interesting that's happening over here in the no-choice condition. What we expect to happen here, if people use the discounting principle wisely and well, is that the two bars are equal. That is, we would expect that a person who is ordered to write a pro-Castro essay is not judged to be any more pro-Castro than somebody who was ordered to write an anti-Castro essay. Earlier, somebody here was ordered to sit in the front row because there was a vacant seat. Are we to assume that she really liked sitting in the front row more than the person who was ordered to sit in the back? Come on, they were ordered to do it. They did it because they're nice folks who were obeying the instructions of somebody who's in authority here. We don't believe that they really prefer front and back, do we? Or do we? What this discrepancy between these two bars, which is a statistically significant, even though it's small, it's a statistically significant tendency, is known as the correspondence bias. The tendency to ascribe to people dispositions that correspond to their behavior, even when strong situational constraints can entirely account for what they did. In 1967, Jones and Harris demonstrated for us, for the first time, this phenomenon of correspondence bias. Now, I could stand here for hours and recite for you a litany of follow-up experiments over the next 20 years that confirm this finding. But I won't. What I'll tell you instead is that in study after study, this phenomenon emerges. In study after study, people tend to attribute behavior to a person's dispositions even when there's no logical reason to do so. In study after study, this has proved to be perhaps the most robust and reliable experimental phenomenon in social psychology. I would submit to you, too, that it's very pervasive in everyday life. When was the last time you were in a restaurant and some snappy waitress came over and said, "What do you want?" and you thought to yourself, "Gee, I bet she's having an awful day. I bet her boss is really a jerk. I bet she doesn't get paid well. I bet she's really a lovely person." Nah, you don't, do you? Instead, you say to yourself, "Boy," we are on TV, aren't we? "Boy, what an unnice woman she is. Well, what a lousy person. Why is she a waitress?" Isn't that exactly what you think? You don't take into account the situational forces that may be responsible for her behavior. Well, the correspondence bias in 1967 emerged in these studies, but remained something of a mystery. Social psychologists kind of waved their hands at it and said a lot of smart things about why it might be happening in these experiments. But nobody knew for sure. I'm pleased to tell you now that after 25 years of research on this topic, social psychologists know what causes the correspondence bias. There's 4 things. 4 things caused correspondence bias: wanting dispositions, misunderstanding situations, misperceiving behavior, and failing to use information. Each of these is a discrete and separable cause of correspondence bias. These are the 4 things that make us think that people do what they do because of the kind of people they are, rather than the kind of situations they're in. Scientists know that the key to controlling anything is prediction. If you want to control something, you got to learn how to predict its behavior. I mean, if you can't go like that and make it do something, at least if you can predict it, you can exert a certain amount of control. Isn't this true? If I can predict the stock market, I don't have to be able to manipulate it. If I can predict it, I can invest wisely. If I can predict the outcome of a ball game, I can bet on it correctly. If I can predict the weather, I can carry an umbrella. Now, what's the key to predicting something? The key to control is prediction, and the key to prediction is having a theory. You know, in the old days, when the eclipses came, people would say, "Oh no, the sun's being swallowed up again." They didn't know when it was going to happen or why it was happening. Nowadays, astronomers have really great theories about how planets wander around in space. And as a result, they can tell us precisely for the next 15 centuries, give or take a couple of seconds, when eclipses are going to happen. We can predict them perfectly, and we can make sure we're not looking up. I want to suggest to you that a dispositional attribution is, in a sense, a theory that enables you to predict other people's behavior. Knowing somebody's traits gives you a great deal of information about them and gives you the ability to control their effect on you. I mean, imagine a person without traits. Imagine somebody do you know anybody without a personality? That's badly said. Do you know somebody who has no characteristics, no dispositions? If you did, I suspect that you wouldn't want to be their friend. They'd be random. They'd be behaving one way one day, one way the next day. It'd be impossible to know if they were going to show up for your party, because you don't know if they're punctual and kind. It'd be hard to know if they're going to give you a birthday present, because you don't know if they're nice or nasty, because they aren't any of those things. A disposition gives you kind of a handle on people. It's a way of saying, "Hey, I know what he's going to do. Fred's a friendly guy. I can predict who's going to bring flowers on National Secretary's Day. Jim's a really good friend. I know who's going to lend me the class notes that I've been missing because I was ill." On and on and on. So, understanding other people's traits, imbuing them, if you will, imbuing dispositions, ascribing dispositions to them, is a way of gaining kind of a form of control over their behavior. Now, as every psychologist since Sigmund Freud has noted, when people want something to be the case, they often see it as the case. Now, there are limits on this process. I mean, I would like to look like Mel Gibson, and I look in the mirror and I don't look a lot like Mel Gibson, do I? But, you know, if the light's just right and I close one eye and turn this way, there's a little bit of a resemblance between me and Mel. We know that people engage in wishful thinking, that to some extent we believe things are the way we'd like them to be, to some extent. So it shouldn't be much of a surprise that people kind of make rose-colored attributions, if you will. That because of our desire to predict other people's behavior, to ascribe dispositions to them in order to control how they affect us, that we tend to do so. What I'm trying to say in a lot of words, and I suppose I could say more simply, is this. Dispositions allow us to predict others, and so we imagine that people have them because it makes us feel awful good. So far, the story is very much like the last 3 minutes of every Star Trek episode, in which Spock turns to Bones and says, "You see, Doctor, it's human passions and emotions that get in the way of correct judgment." And that's what we've seen so far. Our desire to be able to predict and control others is interfering with our ability to make accurate inferences about why they do what they do. But Bones has his day, because it turns out that even a green-blooded, pointy-eared, infernal computer can make the correspondence bias. There are 3 other reasons that people tend to attribute behavior to dispositions, even when they logically should not. Let's go back for a minute to the Lewinian equation, the attributional equation. D equals B minus S. An equation is only good if the values for the variables are properly estimated. Isn't that the case? If you've got a wildly incorrect value for B or S, you're going to get a wildly incorrect answer for D. Computer scientists say GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. You put the wrong values in the variables, the equation can't possibly give you a right answer. It turns out that when people try to estimate S, when they try to assign some value to S, and by that I mean metaphorically, when they try to understand how strongly a situation can control human behavior, they tend to underestimate it. When we try to estimate the value of S, we tend to estimate low. In non-mathematical terms, we tend to misunderstand situations and think that they're less powerful than in fact they are. There's 2 reasons for this. The first is that situations tend to be invisible. You know, I drew for you this car and I didn't draw, but a professional cartoonist drew for you the car and the fan. You had to have a fan there and all these little lines to show situation. It was kind of a pictograph of a situation, but not a particularly compelling one. Most situational forces, most of the environmental and social influences on our behavior have no physical presence. A young woman, a father tells his daughter, "You get your nose pierced and you're disinherited." Okay. We see a young woman walking in a shopping mall and she walks right past the sign that says "Nose is pierced while you wait." Guess they're all while you wait, huh? "Here's my nose, I'll be back in an hour." We see her walk by. Now we know, as omnipotent psychologists who know about her father's threat, that there's a very strong situational force acting on her behavior. She might very well want to have her nose pierced in many different ways, several different nostrils. But she walks right past because her father's threatened her with disinheritance. But what about an observer at the shopping mall? What does that observer see? That observer sees walking. Where's the father's threat? It's not there anywhere. You can't see it. In fact, in this case, it's a situation that exists simply in the mind of the walking woman. Oftentimes, it's the case that the situational forces that are directing other people's behaviors are things we can't possibly see. And if we can't see them, we don't know about them, how can we possibly take them into account? To go back to the equation, people have a tendency to assign S a value of 0, bupkis, nada, nothing, because they don't know there are any situational forces at large. Now, in the Lewinian equation, there are 3 elements, S, B, and D, and we're trying to find D, and we've talked about S, so guess what's coming? You might think that even though it's difficult to properly estimate situational forces, to really understand how strong situations are in guiding behavior, it's pretty much a cinch to understand behavior itself. I mean, You don't even estimate behavior, do you? I mean, you kind of just see it. He was smart. He did something bright. Let me suggest to you that that's not the case. That in fact, B must be estimated in exactly the same way S must be estimated. Not only must we figure out what kind of situation a person's in and how strong its influence is, we must figure out what the person is doing. And this is known as the two-stage model of attribution. An identification stage in which we ask ourselves what is the behavior, and then an attributional stage in which we ask ourselves why did the behavior occur. What I want to suggest to you, and here's the point of the story in case all of it is lost, is that knowledge of situational forces can increase the accuracy of our attributions, but at the same time decrease the accuracy of our identifications and hence cause the correspondence bias. Let me unpack that for you. If it's the case that we have to infer what people are doing rather than just seeing it. I mean, example, has anybody here ever seen somebody help another person? The studio audience shook its head yes. Its collective head, in very small ways, said, yes, I have. I will disagree with you. What you have seen are the motions of limbs in space. What you have heard are the vibrations of air. You've seen heads rotate on their stalks, at least a little bit. You've seen gums flap. You've never seen helping. What you have done is inferred helping from what you've seen. Any inference, as you know, can be wrong. Our inferences about what people are doing can be just as wrong as any other inference that we make in life. What kinds of things influence the accuracy of our behavioral identifications? There are many, but a particularly strong one is our prior knowledge or our expectations. This is a phenomenon known as perceptual assimilation, the tendency to see things as we expect them to be seen. You've all fallen victim to this, if you will, numerous times a day. You're waiting for your friend John to call, the phone rings, you pick it up, somebody says hi, you go, hey John, how you doing? And the person says, it's Bill. And you think, wow, his voice sounded just like John. Hey, his voice didn't sound like John any more than it did any other day. You were expecting Bill, you heard Bill. So people have a tendency to see what they expect to see. And in fact, this is a very important aspect of human perception. Philosophers like Kant are famous for saying, perception without conception is blind, which means if you didn't have expectations about what you were seeing, you wouldn't see nothing at all. So I don't want to give you the idea that perceptual assimilation is a particularly bad thing, but it can, in an interesting way, cause the correspondence bias. The fourth cause of correspondence bias, as you'll remember from the slide that was up, is the failure to use information. What do people do with the estimates? I mean, if they had perfect estimates of B, perfect estimates of S, and they were totally unmotivated to distort their perceptions in the direction of disposition. That is, if the first three causes of correspondence bias were not at large in a particular situation, would people invariably make the correct sort of attribution? No. Not necessarily, because there's one more way that we can go wrong. The two-stage model suggests that there are two general processes, identification and attribution. But that second box is a big box, attribution. What does that mean? What happens inside that box? What are people doing when they actually make attributions? I want to suggest to you that the attribution box can be broken down into two smaller boxes. And understanding what happens in those two smaller boxes will show us that there's a fourth cause of correspondence bias. Quattrone, in 1982, suggested something that, for my money, is the most interesting theoretical suggestion in attribution in the last 25 years. Quattrone said, you know, we've always thought of situational and dispositional attributions as kind of two sides of a coin, two options from which a person can choose. But maybe we should think of them as, instead of options, as sequential operations. Could it be the case, Quattrone suggested, that people always start by making dispositional attributions and then sometimes change their mind? Here's a good metaphor. You know the sliding scales you have on cheap stereos, or you turn the volume up and down? Quattrone asks us to imagine that there is a sliding scale in the sky, one end of which is labeled dispositional and one end of which is labeled situational. And his idea is that Whenever we start making attributions, the knob is here. We always start by making dispositional attributions for people's behavior. It's just that sometimes we go zoom and change them into situational ones. When I see a person, when I read a pro-Castro essay written under free choice, I start by making a dispositional attribution, and then I just stop there, right? I say, yeah, that guy's pro-Castro. When I read a pro-Castro essay that was written by somebody at the behest of their debate coach, according to Quattrone, I say to myself, that guy's really pro-Castro. But wait a minute. His debate coach told him that he had to write this essay, and maybe he's not really so pro-Castro after all. We kind of slide the knob down, if you will. Now, maybe that sounds somewhat tame to you, but this is a really different way to think about attribution, as changing from dispositional to situational rather than choosing between these two explanations of behavior. Let me tell you why this turns out to be important. Gilbert, Pelham, and Krull, and you know by now, I think, in science, that when we talk about our own research, we refer to it in the third person so that we can say things like pioneering and seminal and not seem altogether foolish. Gilbert, Pelham, and Krull suggested that we can combine Quattrone's suggestion about the sliding scale with our knowledge of automaticity in behavior to come up with a whole new theory of attribution, a three-stage model. And let me present it to you now. The three-stage model of attribution suggests there is an identification stage, a stage at which we try to understand what a person's doing. But that attribution box really contains two little boxes. And they're very much the two little boxes that Quattrone suggested. When people make attributions, they start by making dispositional inferences, and then they make situational corrections, if you will. I see a little bit of puzzlement, so just let me give you a flavor of what it feels like to make a dispositional inference and then make a situational correction. Wow, this essay really argues strongly in favor of Fidel. This guy's really pro-Castro, I can tell. But then again, there was a situation that was kind of guiding his behavior. I guess I should take that into account. He's probably not really so pro-Castro when I think about it. All right, that little narration is the cartoon version, stream of consciousness of somebody who is making a dispositional inference and then correcting it situationally. What Gilbert, Pelham, and Krull suggested that was unique is that this first step, the dispositional inference, is automatic. It happens on its own. You don't need to make it happen. And in fact, in lots of cases, it can't even be stopped. The situational correction, on the other hand, is effortful. It takes thought. Now, if you look at this little model, it makes an enormously powerful prediction. Anything in the world that takes your attention away from the attributional task will impair this stage of the attributional process, but not this one. Anything that takes your attention away from thinking deeply about why another person behaved as they did will impair the effortful situational correction, but the automatic dispositional inference just keeps on humming. As a result, anything that takes your attention away from what you're doing will cause you to make dispositional inferences, aka the correspondence bias. The suggestion here is that whenever people don't think deeply about what they're doing, something in their environment takes their attention away for a moment from what they're doing, they fail to take situations into account. So even though, and get this, even though they have perfect estimates of B and perfect estimates of S, they can't always use that estimate of S. It requires attention. And if somebody has come along and said, hey, recite the alphabet backwards for me, you can't do the subtraction. You can't take S out. That's pretty much what I want to say about correspondence bias, and I spent well over an hour talking about these various ways that people can go wrong in their judgments, various ways that we can end up thinking that people do what they do because of their characters, because of their traits, their desires, their intentions, their thoughts, their attitudes, and failing to take into account the situations that may be pushing them to behave as they have. It would be very easy, I think, having listened to this lecture, to lose sight of a very important fact. That is, people seem to do pretty well a lot of the time. We've dwelled on the errors that people can make, on the mistakes to which we are prone, because that's the kind of thing that's interesting to find out about us. We can correct our errors if we know about them. But I don't want you to go away thinking that we are hopeless. That until you heard this lecture, everything you ever thought about anybody was wrong and you better start over. In a sense, we should admire what people can do as much as talk about what they do poorly. But the other side of the coin is equally important. I mean, there are a lot of people in an audience like this, and there are a number of psychologists who will say, well, that's all laboratory experiments. I mean, look, you know, you've shown me in 5 or 6 experiments that people make these silly little errors on these little scales you give them, and hey man, in real life we seem to do all right. Now you explain that, Mr. Psychologist. Look, in real life, we go through our day doing just fine. How could we do just fine if we're so susceptible to this correspondence bias? Do we do just fine? I don't know. Last year, 1,000 women, at least, have been raped by acquaintances that they were sure they knew just fine. 10,000 people, at least, have divorced spouses who at some point in their lives they thought they knew just fine. At least 100,000 people at least in the last 12 months have died in the wars of public officials who at some point voters thought they knew just fine. How do we do in our everyday life? Experiments can't answer that question. I leave it to you. Thanks.